Published and edited by Ligohi Software. Rights have been reserved to this audio-visual recording. To find more books and information about other educational resources, please visit ligohi.com. Dr. Rabbit and Brushtail the Fox. Written by Thomas Clark Hinkle. Dr. Rabbit and Chippy Chipmunk were sitting in Dr. Rabbit's front yard talking. They laughed a good deal as they talked, for it was a lovely morning in the beautiful big green woods, and everyone felt happy. Finally, jolly Dr. Rabbit said he believed he would run over to the big sycamore tree to eat some more of the tender blue grass that grew there. It seemed as if he could eat there all day and all night, he said, because that grass was so good. Chippy Chipmunk said he was getting hungry again too, and he guessed he would be going home to eat the fresh ear of corn he had found that morning. Chippy Chipmunk got up and was starting away, when Dr. Rabbit seized him and said in a low, frightened whisper that scared Chippy half to death, "Come back and sit down and keep as still as anything. Look out there, will you?" Very badly startled, Chippy Chipmunk came back and sat down, and his eyes followed Dr. Rabbit's eyes. Chippy saw an animal such as he had never seen before. This animal looked somewhat like a dog, but Chippy knew right away he was no dog. He was not quite so large as Coyote, and was of a reddish-brown color, with a large, bushy tail. The animal was walking along under the trees not far away, and did not even look in the direction of Dr. Rabbit and little Chippy Chipmunk. But, although he could not tell why, Chippy knew at once that that reddish-brown animal walking along out there under the trees was very dangerous to chipmunks and rabbits and any number of other little animals. Yes, sir, Chippy Chipmunk was dreadfully frightened at once, for he was certain his life and the lives of Stubby Woodchuck, Chatty Red Squirrel and all his other friends were in great danger. But he had never seen such an animal before, so of course he did not know what it was. While Dr. Rabbit and Chippy Chipmunk looked, the strange animal walked along just as if he were not interested in anything. He did not even look toward Dr. Rabbit and Chippy Chipmunk. This deceived innocent Chippy, and he whispered to Dr. Rabbit, "He has not seen us. Let's slip into your house. I don't want him to catch sight of us. Keep right still." Dr. Rabbit whispered in reply, "Just sit still. Yes, he has seen us, don't you deceive yourself about that. But he knows well enough he can't catch us now. He's made up his mind he'll wait until he gets a better chance. But we won't let him know we see him. We'll have to try to deceive him at every turn. Yes, sir, Chippy, we've got to watch out every minute now. We certainly have. He's one of the most cunning animals there is. I'm sorry he's come into our woods." Chippy Chipmunk was so frightened that his teeth were chattering as he asked, "Who is he?" "He's Brushtail the Fox," Dr. Rabbit said. "I saw him a number of times in the woods up along the deep river where I used to live. We'll see more of him, we can count on that. And now, friend Chippy, you must stay right here at my house until we are sure Brushtail has stopped watching us out of the corner of his eye." Dr. Rabbit was right. Brushtail the Fox had seen exactly who was in Dr. Rabbit's front yard, but he did not act as if he knew there was anyone within a mile of him. No, he just kept right on walking slowly under the trees. And then all of a sudden Chatty Red Squirrel almost made him look up. Chatty was high up in a big hackberry tree, and from this safe perch he scolded Brushtail as loudly as he could. "Get out of these woods!" Chatty Squirrel shouted angrily. "You have no right in here. You are just sneaking around trying to catch somebody. But you can't. I won't let you. I'll tell on you. Look here, everybody, here is old Brushtail the Fox. I know you, Mr. Brushtail. I've seen you before in the woods up along the deep river. Look out, everybody. Brushtail is around. He's right under this tree, right this minute. I can see him. Look out for Mr. Brushtail. Here he is." Well, Dr. Rabbit and Chippy Chipmunk watched and listened while Chatty Squirrel scolded Brushtail the Fox so loudly. But Brushtail pretended to pay no attention to Chatty. The fact was that he did hear every word Chatty Squirrel said, and he was pretty angry about it too, because you see he did not want all the little creatures of the big green woods to know he was around. He wanted to get one or two of them for breakfast before they even dreamed he was anywhere near. But even if he was angry, Brushtail knew, of course, that he could not climb that tree after Chatty Squirrel, so he just walked on. He decided that he would make Chatty pay for this. Indeed he would. He would catch him the very first of all. And so as Dr. Rabbit and Chippy Chipmunk looked and listened, Brushtail, without saying a word, walked on and finally slipped out of sight among some leafy bushes. "I'm going home this minute," Chippy Chipmunk exclaimed, his voice trembling with fear. And away he went for his stump as fast as he could run. After Chippy had gone, Dr. Rabbit said to himself, "Well, I do declare. So Brushtail the fox has found the big green woods, and likely enough intends to live here. If he does, we'll certainly all have to watch out every minute. Indeed we will. I'm glad Chatty Squirrel is scolding so loudly. Perhaps our friends will all hear and be on the lookout." Chatty Squirrel, who had followed along in the branches of the trees and kept sight of Slinky Brushtail, was now heard quite a distance away, scolding louder than ever. "I wonder what Chatty is scolding about out there now," Dr. Rabbit said. "It sounds as if he were still talking to Brushtail. Perhaps Brushtail has stopped out there, and possibly he has caught something and is eating it. I'm going to slip out that way and see. I'll take the path that leads past several briar patches, and if Mr. Fox runs for me, I'll just slip into a briar patch. If he tries to follow me in there, he knows what he'll get. He'll get his eyes scratched out with the briars. My, how Chatty is scolding. He's scolding Brushtail, too. Brushtail must be doing something unusual, or Chatty would not talk so excitedly." Dr. Rabbit hurried away from his home toward the place where he heard Chatty Squirrel scolding Brushtail the fox. Dr. Rabbit, to tell the truth, was afraid to venture out there so close to Brushtail, but then, he reasoned, he would have to go sooner or later and get something to eat, so he might as well venture out now and see what the old villain was doing. Dr. Rabbit kept in the path that led past several briar patches, and this made him feel pretty safe. The nearer Dr. Rabbit came to the place where Chatty Squirrel was scolding, the louder sounded Chatty's angry voice. Dr. Rabbit crept close and slipped into a briar patch. Not more than 20 feet away, lying on the ground as still as if he were dead, was Brushtail the fox, but he did not deceive Dr. Rabbit in the least. Dr. Rabbit knew instantly what Brushtail wanted. He wanted Chatty Squirrel. Because Brushtail lay so still and paid not the least attention to his scolding, Chatty Squirrel became really puzzled. He stopped scolding and said to himself, "Now I wonder if that old scamp is dead. He certainly lies there very still. Anyway, I believe I'll just slip down on the ground for a minute and see. If he's just playing dead, he'll come after me when I get on the ground. Then I'll know for sure, and I'll go back up the tree in a hurry." Chatty Squirrel scrambled down the tree, and as soon as he reached the ground he began scolding Brushtail the fox. He thought, of course, that this would make Brushtail jump up if he were only playing dead. But Brushtail paid no attention to Chatty. He lay as still as a dead fox. Chatty Squirrel ran a little way toward him, but was afraid to venture far. Just then he happened to see Dr. Rabbit hiding under the briar patch, motioning for him to come over, and looking as though he knew something very funny. There happened to be another tree by the briar patch, so Chatty Squirrel sprang right over to see what Dr. Rabbit wanted. Dr. Rabbit whispered something in Chatty's ear, and then they chuckled softly to themselves. The more Chatty thought about what Dr. Rabbit had said, the more he laughed, not very loudly, of course, because he did not want Brushtail the fox to hear. "Hurry along now before he gets up," Dr. Rabbit whispered, and away ran Chatty Squirrel back to the tree he had left. Chatty scrambled back up the tree in a hurry, and began scolding Brushtail louder than ever. He did not say a word about Dr. Rabbit, of course. He just went right on scolding as if nothing had happened. Now Brushtail the fox was not dead, and as he lay there very still he thought that Chatty Squirrel's curiosity would get the better of him and Chatty would come down the tree and close enough so that he could pounce upon him. But Chatty did just exactly what Dr. Rabbit had told him to do. "I wish," he said aloud, "that I knew whether Mr. Fox is really dead. He lies so still, I believe he is, and if he lies there much longer I shall have to go down and see. Yes, I'll have to go down and poke him and see." Brushtail the fox could scarcely keep from smacking his lips when Chatty said this, but he did not move, of course. He lay perfectly still, not even winking an eye, for he was very hungry, and he hoped Chatty Squirrel would decide to hurry and come down. And all the time that Chatty Squirrel up in the tree was scolding, Dr. Rabbit was working at something in the nearby thicket. Chatty, you see, was going to keep Brushtail's attention until Dr. Rabbit played a good joke on old Brushtail. Now, this was what Dr. Rabbit was doing in the nearby thicket. He gathered some moss and rolled it into a big ball. Then he took a bottle of medicine from his medicine case. The bottle had ammonia in it and Dr. Rabbit poured the medicine all over and through the big ball of moss. My, but that ammonia smelled strong. I should say it did smell strong. It was so strong, in fact, that Dr. Rabbit had to turn his head partly away from the moss while he poured the medicine on it. Now Dr. Rabbit had to be very, very careful. He picked up the ball of moss in his front paws and walked toward Brushtail the fox, who lay on the ground with his eyes shut tight. Chatty Squirrel kept up a very loud scolding as Dr. Rabbit slipped up to Brushtail. Then when he was very near, Dr. Rabbit threw that moss with all the terribly strong ammonia right on Brushtail's head and over his nose. Brushtail got such a big whiff of the medicine that he almost strangled. My, how he did jump and yell. He was terribly scared, because he did not know what had happened. Then he heard Chatty upon the limb laughing and shouting for joy. Dr. Rabbit ran back to the edge of the thicket, and he was laughing too. It certainly did look funny to see Brushtail the fox standing and staring at that moss as if he thought it was something alive. When Brushtail saw that a joke had been played on him, he was terribly angry. He knew, of course, he could not get Chatty, so he made a rush for Dr. Rabbit. But Dr. Rabbit skipped into the thicket, picked up his medicine case and shouted, "Good day, Mr. Fox. I guess you won't have Chatty for breakfast. You'd better eat the moss ball." And away Dr. Rabbit ran. In a twinkling he was out of sight in the leafy woods. Brushtail the fox ran after Dr. Rabbit as fast as he could go, but it was no use. He could not find him. Now it happened that Dr. Rabbit had not gone far at all. He was not far from home, so he just hid behind a big log. And he was watching Brushtail the fox all the time. My, how he did jump and yell. After a time Brushtail sat down and kept still. His sharp eyes, however, were looking in every direction. He thought he might see Dr. Rabbit by keeping quiet and looking about him. Dr. Rabbit, as I have said, was so close to his home that he knew he was safe, so he walked quietly from behind the log, holding his medicine case and acting just as though he did not know that Brushtail the fox was anywhere about. Brushtail quickly lay down and was as quiet as possible. Then Dr. Rabbit stopped, looked back, and said pleasantly, "It's a nice morning, Brushy." That surely surprised Brushtail, but when he saw Dr. Rabbit's home tree not far away, he knew he could not catch him. So he smiled and said, "I've just been playing with you all the time. Do come on over to my home, neighbor Rabbit. I have something very fine there to show you. We'll have some good times together." Ha! Wise Dr. Rabbit laughed, as he started toward his big tree. "Yes," he continued, "I suppose you have some very cruel teeth to show me, Mr. Brushtail, but I can see them quite as well as I care to." Ha! And Dr. Rabbit ran for his tree. Brushtail ran after him, but Dr. Rabbit ran fast and reached his home in safety. There he peeked out and saw Brushtail steal into some bushes. Now when Dr. Rabbit ran into the big hollow tree that was his home, Brushtail the fox slunk into some leafy bushes nearby and lay down without making a sound. "I'll just wait here," Brushtail whispered to himself, "and that smart old rabbit will be coming out pretty soon. He won't know that I'm anywhere about." But old Brushtail was very much mistaken, for Dr. Rabbit had peeked out of his front door just as soon as he was inside his house, and you remember he saw Brushtail steal into the bushes. No, sir, he wasn't to be deceived this time. For a long time Brushtail lay in the bushes. He lay so quietly that not a leaf on the branches about him stirred. His glittering eyes were turned toward Dr. Rabbit's tree, and every little while he showed his long, sharp teeth as he smiled at the thought of the good meal that big fat rabbit would make. But all the while Dr. Rabbit watched from an upstairs window where Brushtail could not see him, although Dr. Rabbit could plainly see the pointed nose and sharp, gleaming eyes of his enemy. Presently Dr. Rabbit heard the rustle of leaves and the gay chatter of Chatty Red Squirrel as he bounded into the branches of a tree overlooking the bushes that hid Brushtail. Dr. Rabbit drew a long breath of relief. He wasn't afraid of Brushtail the fox when he was safe in his big hollow tree. Oh no, you mustn't think that, not for a moment. But you see, Dr. Rabbit was getting pretty tired and stiff from watching so cautiously from his upstairs window, and yet he couldn't quite bring himself to the point of going downstairs and forgetting Brushtail. No, indeed, he couldn't quite do that. So Dr. Rabbit was glad to see Chatty Red Squirrel, for he knew just what would happen. And sure enough, shortly after, Chatty Squirrel saw Brushtail lying low in the bushes, and then how he did scold. "Aha, old Brushtail, I see you hiding in the bushes. Thought I wouldn't see you, didn't you? Thought I wouldn't see you. But I see you, all right. You can't trick Chatty, no sir. Oh, I know you are looking for Dr. Rabbit," and Chatty's tone became angrier at the thought of Brushtail waiting to pounce upon his good friend, Dr. Rabbit. "You are just waiting for Dr. Rabbit to come home and then spring out at him. Get out of here, get out of here," screamed Chatty. Brushtail the fox was angry. Well, I should say he was. He knew that Dr. Rabbit would hear Chatty Red Squirrel's scolding, and would know that he was hiding ready to eat him if he came out of the tree. Brushtail was so angry that he snarled, but he slunk away through the bushes without saying a word to Chatty Red. Brushtail is wise enough to know that there is no use arguing with Chatty Squirrel, for Chatty is altogether too noisy a talker. I should say he is. When Brushtail slunk away through the bushes, Dr. Rabbit called to Chatty Red Squirrel, but Chatty did not hear him. He had scampered away to another tree, still talking loudly. Then, Dr. Rabbit turned quickly and leaned out of his window to watch Brushtail the fox. Brushtail was trotting off through the big green woods in a direction in which Dr. Rabbit seldom went. And Dr. Rabbit noticed that he seemed to be afraid someone would see him. He looked on each side of him as he went along, and every now and then he took a big jump sidewise. Dr. Rabbit was certainly interested now, for he believed Brushtail the fox was going to hide somewhere. Probably he was going to hide in a place where he hid every day. Yes, sir, Brushtail certainly was cautious now, and he must have jumped to one side as many as 5 times while Dr. Rabbit was watching him. Then in a little while he reached a part of the woods where the brush and leaves were so thick that Dr. Rabbit could just barely see him as he slipped along. When Brushtail the fox slipped into the place where there were so many leafy bushes, it was very hard for Dr. Rabbit to see him from his big tree. Sometimes he lost sight of Brushtail altogether, and then for an instant he would see his long, sharp nose, or his reddish-brown coat, or his big bushy tail. And all the time Brushtail became more and more cautious. He moved so slowly and so quietly among the bushes that Dr. Rabbit had to strain his eyes to see him. Then suddenly Brushtail jumped high up onto the dead limb of a big fallen tree. He walked out on this limb, then jumped far out into a dense thicket and disappeared. Yes, sir, Brushtail the fox was gone. Dr. Rabbit stood by his window in the tree and looked and looked. He thought he would presently see a sharp nose or a bushy tail, but he did not. Brushtail was hiding somewhere in that thicket. Well, Dr. Rabbit exclaimed, I certainly should like to know what old Brushtail is doing in there. I am positive he is in that thicket. He never could have slipped out without my seeing him. Yes, sir, he's in there. And that's probably where he always hides. Likely enough, he has a den in there. I shouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of rocks in there and Brushtail the fox has a big hole away back under them. Well, Dr. Rabbit continued, talking softly to himself, I'm going to slip out there as near as possible and keep watch and see if I can discover anything more about Brushtail. I must not tell anyone as yet what I have seen. No, if I want to get a lot of information, I must just keep still and do the finding out myself. It isn't safe to trust too many people. Dr. Rabbit ran downstairs and was starting out into the woods to try to get nearer Brushtail's hiding place when he saw something that made him keep still and watch. Farmer Row and his boy were coming through the woods toward Dr. Rabbit's tree. Just as they went past, Dr. Rabbit heard Farmer Row say, Yes, I'm certain that there is a fox in these woods. That was a fox's track we saw in the yard this morning, and that was a fox, I am sure, that took the old white hen last night. Our chickens will be in danger until we get rid of him. Do you suppose he hides in these woods in the daytime? Asked Farmer Row's boy. I shouldn't be surprised, replied Farmer Row. In fact, I'm pretty sure he hides close by. There is one thing that puzzles me, however, and that is that although Yappy trailed that fox directly from the chicken yard, he lost the trail right in the woods and could not pick it up again. The fox has played some trick, of course, said Farmer Row, and we must try and find out what it is. I really shouldn't be surprised, he went on, if that fox is lying around close enough to see us this second. We'll just keep watch until we discover his hiding place. Dr. Rabbit did not find out anything more about Brushtail the fox that day, nor for several days. But it was only a very short time until all the little creatures of the big green woods knew that Brushtail the fox was around, and they were afraid to poke their noses out of their homes. Stubby Woodchuck had seen Brushtail 3 times, and he said Brushtail certainly did look fierce. He looked so fierce he took my appetite away for several hours each time I saw him, said Stubby Woodchuck, and I am sure he looks fully as terrible as Kiwi Coyote or Tom Wildcat. Yes, sir, we have a very mean and dangerous enemy in Mr. Brushtail, and we must keep watch every second. I wish he'd go away and stay away, said Chippy Chipmunk, who was always easily frightened. But he doesn't expect to leave at all, Dr. Rabbit informed his friends. He expects to live here in these woods, right along. He does, exclaimed poor Chippy Chipmunk, his voice trembling with fear. How do you know he expects to live here? Well, explained Dr. Rabbit, I have seen quite enough to convince me that Brushtail expects to make his home in the big green woods. In fact, I am in position to know that he has a home here right now. It's all fixed up, and he's living in it. He spends his time there except when he's out hunting us or after one of Farmer Row's nice fat hens. Where is old Brushtail's home? Stubby Woodchuck and Chippy Chipmunk demanded in the same breath. Don't talk so loud, Dr. Rabbit warned his friends. Brushtail might be hiding so near he could hear every word you say. The fact is, I can't tell you any more at present. It would not help if I told you more, and it might get out so Brushtail would hear of it. Just keep still about what I've said and watch for Brushtail every second you are out in the woods. In the meantime, whenever I get a chance, I will hide in a certain place, where I can see him often enough, I think, to discover what his plans are. Then when I find out all I can, I will slip around quietly and tell you. I saw Farmer Row and his boy passing through our woods this morning, Stubby Woodchuck said. I wonder what they were after. They were after Brushtail, Dr. Rabbit explained. I heard them talking and I heard them say they were trying to find out where he lives. Dear me, I hope they'll run him away so he'll never come back, said Chippy Chipmunk, with a troubled look. "They'll probably have to find out first where he lives," said Dr. Rabbit, "and I believe that is going to be pretty hard for them to do. But still, Yappy has a very sharp nose, and in time he may find Brushtail's den." It was dinner time, so Dr. Rabbit and Stubby Woodchuck and Cheepy Chipmunk separated, each slipping home as quietly as he could. Dr. Rabbit did not see Brushtail the fox again for several days. Then one morning when the sun came up warm and bright and all the little creatures of the big green woods were feeling very happy, Dr. Rabbit decided that he would try again. He made up his mind to slip over to that thicket where he had last seen Brushtail, and see what he could discover with his sharp eyes. There were a good many briar patches along the way, and Dr. Rabbit kept as near these as possible, so he was safe, even though the way was a little longer. You can be very sure, too, that Dr. Rabbit kept his eyes wide open all the time. But he did not see the least sign of Brushtail the fox, and decided that he was probably somewhere in that dense thicket. "Perhaps," thought Dr. Rabbit, "old Brushtail is in there right now eating a chicken he has stolen from Farmer Rowe." The very thought of getting any nearer that thicket made Dr. Rabbit tremble with fear. Still, there was a fine big briar patch close to the thicket, and Dr. Rabbit decided he would run for this. He had hidden in that briar patch several times from various enemies, and was familiar with every inch of it. He knew he would be safe from Brushtail in the briar patch, and all Brushtail could do if he saw Dr. Rabbit hiding there would be just to wait outside. But he would have to give up in the end, because Dr. Rabbit never would come out of a briar patch so long as an enemy was waiting for him. Dr. Rabbit got all ready, and then he ran for that briar patch. He ran as hard as he could, and dived into the briar patch just as if Brushtail were very close behind him, because, you see, it might be that Brushtail was very close. Then Dr. Rabbit crept to the center of the briar patch and sat down. He decided that if necessary he would stay in the briar patch all day and watch. He knew Brushtail the fox had some kind of a secret in that thicket, or he never would have been so careful about getting into it. Dr. Rabbit waited for about 2 hours, and he was already getting tired when all of a sudden he sat as still as a stone. In fact, he sat so perfectly still that I doubt if you could have seen him even if you had been looking right at him. The reason why Dr. Rabbit sat still so quickly was that he saw a movement in the leafy thicket. Presently the bushes parted, and who do you suppose came out? No, it was not Brushtail, it was Mrs. Brushtail. And now Dr. Rabbit knew exactly why Brushtail had been so careful about getting into that thicket. It was Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail's home. And it was here, of course, that Farmer Rowe's hens were disappearing, and this was where Dr. Rabbit and Stubby Woodchuck and all their friends would go if they didn't watch out. Yes, sir. This was where a great many of the little creatures of the big green woods would disappear if Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail did not leave. While Dr. Rabbit was looking at Mrs. Brushtail, she yawned, showing all of her long, sharp teeth. Although he was safe in the briar patch, Dr. Rabbit trembled. He was a little too close to old Mrs. Brushtail to feel at ease. Of course, Dr. Rabbit was greatly surprised to see Mrs. Brushtail in the thicket. And still, after he thought about it, he was not so surprised either. You see, it was spring and just the time of year for Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail to find themselves a new home if they needed one. Mrs. Brushtail stood there looking about in every direction with her sharp eyes. Then she gave a great spring and landed on the limb of the fallen tree. She walked along the limb until she came to the end of it, and then jumped, as Brushtail had done, as far out as she could. Only Mrs. Brushtail did not jump toward the thicket, she jumped away from it. She stood again looking all around and listening for a short while, then trotted away through the woods toward Farmer Rowe's, and was soon out of sight. Dr. Rabbit thought to himself, Mrs. Brushtail is going over to the edge of the woods nearest to Farmer Rowe's. She's going to hide there and see if some hen doesn't come out into the woods to hunt bugs and grasshoppers. And he made up his mind that as long as he was safe he would just wait where he was and see if Mrs. Brushtail would come back. Well, he did not have to wait very long. As he sat in the briar patch listening, he heard a terrible cackling over toward the edge of the woods nearest Farmer Rose. It sounded as if chickens were very much frightened and were running in every direction. In a short time, Dr. Rabbit saw Mrs. Brushtail coming through the woods. And sure enough, she had one of Farmer Rose's big white hens in her mouth. Mrs. Brushtail held the hen by the neck, and after making a wide circle and jumping to one side as far as she could, she came to the fallen tree. When she looked up at the high limb, she seemed puzzled. You see, she could not jump so high with the hen. But she was pretty wise. She laid the hen upon the trunk of the tree, then jumped upon the limb above, and reaching down, picked up the hen and walked out along the limb toward the leafy thicket. Then she sprang into the thicket and disappeared. How Dr. Rabbit did want to see the inside of that thicket. And what made him all the more curious was that he was certain he heard a number of growls after Mrs. Brushtail disappeared in there. And the growls did not sound like Mrs. Brushtail's voice, or like Brushtail's either. Yes, sir, there was something very interesting going on in that thicket, and Dr. Rabbit made up his mind he must see what it was, if possible. He wondered where Brushtail was. Dr. Rabbit disliked to go any nearer the thicket unless he knew where that sly old fox was. But, he said to himself, likely enough Mr. Brushtail is in the thicket with Mrs. Brushtail and is helping her eat that chicken. Anyway, it's only a little distance to that tree with a hole in the base and a lot of prickly vines around it. I'm going to run for it. The distance is so short that Brushtail would not have time to get me even if he saw me. I'll get to the tree, and if Brushtail should come after me, I'll run into the hole at the base of the tree. I'll find out about old Brushy before he knows it. And the first thing they know, they will be going out of these woods in a hurry. But I must be very, very careful. I should say I must. I must watch every second. My, how those animals in that thicket do growl. It sounds almost as if they were quarreling. Dr. Rabbit was just ready to run to the tree with the prickly vines around it when he crouched low and sat very still again. He heard somebody coming through the woods, and pretty soon he saw that it was Farmer Rowe. The farmer stopped when he got close to the briar patch and muttered to himself, "Every spring I have to rid these woods of a fox or two. I guess I'll just put out a little bait for them and see how that will work." As soon as Dr. Rabbit heard Farmer Rowe coming through the woods, he noticed that everything in the thicket grew very quiet. I should say it did. There was not the least sound in there, not a single growl. And there Farmer Rowe stood within 20 feet of the home of Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail without ever dreaming of it. Farmer Rowe had gloves on, and he held a number of pieces of cheese on one hand. He put several of these pieces of cheese under the fallen tree. Right near the thicket he placed some more cheese, partly under some dead leaves. Then Farmer Rowe went around placing the cheese here and there where he thought the fox would be most likely to find it. After a time he put the last piece of cheese under an old log. Then he straightened up and said, "There, now. That ought to fix him, or both of them, if there are two instead of one. I'm glad Yappy has been trained not to eat anything he finds out in the woods," he added, "for this bait would be the end of him too. And that would never do." And Farmer Rowe walked back through the woods toward his house. After a while the sound of his heavy footsteps died away. Everything in the thicket was perfectly still. There was not a sound. Dr. Rabbit waited and listened. Then he heard a movement inside the thicket. Presently Mrs. Brushtail came out, sat down, and looked in the direction Farmer Rowe had taken. While she sat there, Mr. Brushtail came trotting up from somewhere out in the woods. Dr. Rabbit heard the two talking very rapidly and excitedly, but they talked so low he could not understand what they said. He wanted very much to know what they said, but what interested him still more was that he again heard those growls in the thicket. He wondered who it could be, since neither Brushtail nor Mrs. Brushtail was in there now. Well, after Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail had talked for a while, Brushtail went right up to the old dead log where Farmer Rowe had placed some of the cheese. Dr. Rabbit thought this would be the end of Brushtail the fox. You see, Dr. Rabbit, being a doctor, knew at once that Farmer Rowe had poisoned that cheese. Yes, sir, he had put poison in it for Mr. Fox, and if Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail should eat just one of those pieces of cheese, it would certainly cause their death. But Dr. Rabbit was certainly surprised at what happened. Brushtail took the piece of cheese carefully in his mouth and carried it to a small hole a little distance away. Then he hunted around until he found every piece of poisoned cheese Farmer Rowe had put out. And each time he found a piece of cheese, he did just what he did with the first piece. He carried it to that hole and dropped it in. When he had finished, he stood and looked down at all those pieces of cheese. Then he began scratching leaves and dirt into the hole. Once in a while he would turn around and look down into the hole and laugh. Then he would turn his back again and just make the leaves and dirt fly into that hole. Well, he scratched and scratched and scratched until there was not a bit of cheese anywhere to be seen. The hole was full of leaves and dirt, so you never could have found it. Mrs. Brushtail came out and smiled at Brushtail, and both of them looked at Farmer Rowe's house and laughed and laughed. But Dr. Rabbit was not pleased. I should say he wasn't pleased, and he wondered how these two terrible creatures would ever be driven away from the woods. And he wondered more than ever who it was that kept growling in the thicket. After Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail had gone back into the thicket, Dr. Rabbit wanted to run home. He surely was uncomfortable so near to Brushtail and Mrs. Brushtail. And still, he thought to himself, since I am here, I'll just stay a little longer and discover all I can. Well, the growling went on for a while in the thicket, and then something happened that certainly surprised Dr. Rabbit. Mrs. Brushtail came out into the open with Farmer Rowe's chicken, partly eaten, and she was followed by 4 little foxes. Mrs. Brushtail dropped the chicken on the ground for the little foxes, and then she sprang upon a log and just lay there and watched them. Mr. Fox trotted off into the woods again. He's probably going after another hen, thought Dr. Rabbit, or after Stubby Woodchuck or Chatty Red Squirrel or any of us he can catch. And Dr. Rabbit hoped all his little friends would be on the lookout. While Mrs. Brushtail lay upon the log and looked on proudly, how the little foxes did pull at that dead chicken and growl. And so there are the growlers I heard in the thicket. Dr. Rabbit thought to himself. Those little foxes might have looked pretty to some people, they were so young and so playful and so funny. But they did not look pretty to Dr. Rabbit. Indeed they did not. Their tiny teeth, sharp as needles, pulled feathers and sank into the chicken. It was certainly true that Mrs. Brushtail was teaching her very small children how to eat chicken, and as she lay on the log and watched them, she seemed perfectly satisfied with them. After the little foxes had growled and pulled at the chicken for a good while, Brushtail was seen coming through the woods with something in his mouth. Then suddenly Dr. Rabbit became almost sick with fear. He thought for a second that Brushtail had caught Stubby Woodchuck, but it proved to be no one but a large wood rat that had lately grown so cross and savage that all the little creatures of the big green woods were afraid of him. Brushtail dropped the wood rat down before the little foxes, and how they did begin pulling and biting him. Mrs. Brushtail up on the log smiled ever so broadly at this. But it was not a pleasing smile to Dr. Rabbit, hiding in the briar patch. I should say not. It was a terrible smile. The next instant Yappy came tearing through the woods, right toward the thicket, and Dr. Rabbit had a moment of hope. But Mrs. Brushtail just uttered one quick, low growl, and every little fox scurried into the thicket. That time Dr. Rabbit had a good view of the inside of the thicket, and he saw what became of the foxes. They went into a hole under some rocks by a large pawpaw bush. So that, said Dr. Rabbit to himself, is where Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail and their little brushies have their den. Brushtail did not run into the thicket with Mrs. Brushtail and the little foxes. When he saw Yappy coming toward the thicket, he ran right toward the excited dog and then hid behind another thicket. When Yappy came near, Brushtail sprang right out, and away he ran. Yappy bayed loudly, and away he went through the woods after Brushtail. You see now what Brushtail was doing. He was leading Yappy away from that den of little foxes. When Mrs. Brushtail and the four little brushies ran into the hole in the thicket and Father Brushtail ran away through the woods with Yappy in hot pursuit, Dr. Rabbit decided he had better be going. He had discovered a great deal anyway, and now he wanted to find some of his friends and tell them about it. Dr. Rabbit decided first to go over to the wide prairie and see his friend Jack Rabbit. Dr. Rabbit was not much afraid to cross the wide prairie, now that Kiwi Coyote was gone and Brushtail the fox was busy, for the time at least. Dr. Rabbit had not been over to see Jack Rabbit's family for a long time, and he was considerably surprised to find Jack Rabbit laid up with a sprained foot. Jack Rabbit said he had sprained his foot the day before while running from some terrible creature that looked somewhat like Kiwi Coyote and just a little like a dog, but not exactly like either of them. He had a large, bushy tail, Jack Rabbit explained, and his coat was a reddish-brown color. He jumped out from behind some bunch grass and came at me so swiftly that I jumped and turned quickly. And that was how I sprained my foot. He certainly is a fierce and dangerous creature, and I wondered if any of the rest of you had seen him, Jack Rabbit concluded. Indeed we have, Dr. Rabbit replied. I'll bandage your foot now, he continued, and then we can talk about this new enemy. Mrs. Jack Rabbit, Dr. Rabbit said looking at her over his gold glasses, I'll thank you for that bottle of chloroform liniment I left here some time ago. Mrs. Jack Rabbit brought out the bottle of liniment, and after Dr. Rabbit had bathed Jack Rabbit's foot with some of the liniment he bandaged it quite snugly. That feels fine, said Jack Rabbit, getting right up and standing on all 4 feet. I'm so glad you came over, Doctor. That foot feels so good I know I can dance a little. And Jack Rabbit started to dance a little, but he said, ouch, right away, and everybody laughed, even Jack Rabbit. His foot was not quite well enough for dancing. Then Dr. Rabbit said, I told you some of the rest of us had seen that same animal that chased you, Jack Rabbit. I am sure it was the same animal, from the way you described him. It is Brushtail the fox. He has just lately moved into the big green woods, and intends to make his home there right along. What makes the matter worse for all of us is that not only has Mr. Brushtail come, but he has brought his whole family. Oh, dear me, exclaimed Mrs. Jack Rabbit. I thought one of them was enough. But all of them, well, that makes it pretty serious for us. But it might be worse, said Dr. Rabbit, who always sees the bright side of everything. You see, he continued, 4 of those foxes are so small that they are harmless. Besides, Farmer Rowe and his boy are on the lookout for that whole fox family, and they may get rid of them in a very short time. I thought once, Dr. Rabbit continued, of letting Yappy run me right to that thicket where the fox family lives. But if I did, Brushtail or Mrs. Brushtail would surely be right there to lead Yappy away off into the woods. No, if Farmer Rowe or his boy doesn't stumble onto their den, I'll have to think up some way myself to get rid of that fox family. I'll bring my imagination into play, said Dr. Rabbit smiling. What does imagination mean, sir? Little Billy Rabbit asked wonderingly. It means, said Dr. Rabbit, that you must think and think and think until you think out something quite new. Then Dr. Rabbit patted all the little rabbits on the head, except Billy Rabbit, whom he chucked under the chin, as he bade them all a very pleasant good morning. Keep a sharp lookout, and don't worry, Dr. Rabbit said with a smile as he left. If Farmer Rowe does not get rid of that fox family, I'll think out some way myself. And he ran like a gray streak back across the wide prairie toward the big green woods. The next morning quite early, Dr. Rabbit received a call to visit a new woodchuck family that had recently moved into the north part of the big green woods. Dr. Rabbit told Father Woodchuck, who came over after him, that he would be along in a very few moments. Then he shut the door and began to get ready. Dr. Rabbit always dressed with special care when he was called to a new family. He got out his silk hat and brushed it carefully. He curled his mustache until it looked just right. Then he put on his finest pair of gold glasses, which he kept laid away for such occasions. He looked very nice, I can tell you, in his new blue coat, his bright red trousers, and his finest pair of soft white shoes. He surely did. Dr. Rabbit was ready. He picked up his best medicine case, filled with the finest of medicines, and started toward the home of the new family of woodchucks. When Dr. Rabbit reached the place, he found it was one of the youngsters who was sick. In fact, it was Thomas Woodchuck, the pet of the family. His name was not just Tommy. It was Thomas, and everybody called him that. Dr. Rabbit sat down by the bed and said, "Let me see your tongue, Thomas." You see, Dr. Rabbit had asked what Thomas' name was. He always did this. It helped the children not to feel afraid of him. Little Thomas Woodchuck put out his tongue. I see. That will do, Thomas," said Dr. Rabbit cheerfully. "Your tongue is badly coated. Your pulse is pretty rapid, too." Then Dr. Rabbit continued to observe little Thomas Woodchuck, just doctors do when they are treating a patient. Dr. Rabbit looked very wisely over his fine gold glasses at all the rest of the family who were standing about and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Woodchuck, your son has some stomach trouble from eating too many of those raw peanuts Farmer Rowe has stored in his cob house." Well, sir, that was exactly the truth. They all wondered how Dr. Rabbit knew what Thomas had eaten. But Dr. Rabbit just had his eyes open and put two and two together. He knew the peanuts were in Farmer Rowe's cob house. And then he saw a lot of peanut hulls right under the cover of the bed where little Thomas Woodchuck lay. "Thomas," said Dr. Rabbit, "you must not eat so many of those peanuts." Dr. Rabbit gave Thomas 3 big black pills and told him to swallow them all at once. Thomas did, and they were so bitter he tried to spit them out after he had swallowed them, but he could not do it, of course, and so they went right to work curing him. "You will be quite well tomorrow, Thomas," Dr. Rabbit said cheerfully, and the whole Woodchuck family breathed easier. Then Mrs. Woodchuck said, "Doctor, I hear 2 terrible foxes have come into our woods." Dr. Rabbit frowned at Mrs. Woodchuck to make her keep still about the foxes near Thomas, for fear he might be frightened. He was always very careful about this when visiting his patients. "Well, I must be going. Goodbye, Thomas," Dr. Rabbit said, just as if he had not heard Mrs. Woodchuck. Then when he was out in the kitchen, he whispered very low to Father and Mother Woodchuck, "Yes, 2 terrible foxes have come into the big green woods, but I did not want Thomas to hear." "But don't you worry, Mrs. Woodchuck," Dr. Rabbit went on, because he saw how troubled she looked. "Don't you worry a bit. I thought of a plan to get rid of Kiwi Coyote and also of Tom Wildcat, and if Farmer Rowe does not get rid of Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail, I will. Good morning." And Dr. Rabbit slipped out of the door and was gone. It was a mighty good thing that Dr. Rabbit kept a sharp lookout on his way home from the woodchuck house. If he had not been watching, he might have run right into Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail, who stood talking behind a large elm tree. Dr. Rabbit heard them and saw them at the same time. He was so close that he was afraid even to run. So he crept noiselessly under a dense leafy thicket near at hand. Dr. Rabbit was pretty badly scared, because there was not a briar patch anywhere near. So he did the safest thing. He crouched down on the ground, kept still, and listened. Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail, talking behind the tree, never dreamed, of course, that there was anybody close by listening. They talked pretty softly, but Dr. Rabbit was so near that he could hear every word they said. Brushtail was talking. "Yes," he said, "that dog has a very sharp nose, and he is bound to find our den sooner or later. So I think, Mrs. Fox, we had better move you and the children clear out of these woods. I'll take you to a new den in the woods away off up the river. There is not much in the way of rabbits and woodchucks and chickens up there, but I'll keep on spending most of my time down here. You see, I can catch the rabbits and woodchucks and chickens, and carry them up to you." "Very well, dear," said Mrs. Brushtail. "I think that is an excellent plan. When shall we move?" "This very day," Brushtail said. "We'll get the young foxes right away and start off with them." The sooner we get them out of here, the better it will be for all of us." Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail trotted off toward the thicket in which they had their den. Dr. Rabbit was still a little scared, but he believed he would follow at a distance and see for himself whether Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail actually did move the little foxes. Mr. and Mrs. Brushtail went into the thicket, and in a very short time came out again. And sure enough, each of them carried a little fox by the back of its neck. They walked across the shallow murmuring brook and laid the two little brushies down on the other side in a thicket. Then they came back and carried the other two little brushies over in the same way. As they went past him this last time, Dr. Rabbit heard Brushtail say to Mrs. Brushtail, "You can just wait with them in the thicket on the other side of Murmuring Brook until I carry two of them up the river to the new den. When I come back we can carry the other two." You see, foxes can carry their baby foxes by the back of the neck and not hurt them at all. Well, Dr. Rabbit was glad and hungry at the same time. He now hurried right over to the nice, tender blue grass under the big sycamore tree. There he found Chatty Red Squirrel, Cheepy Chipmunk, and quite a number of his other friends, who all wanted to know at once if Dr. Rabbit had found out anything more about Mr. Fox. Dr. Rabbit did know a great deal, as you know, and he told his friends he would tell them. Chatty Red Squirrel, Cheepy Chipmunk, and all the rest of Dr. Rabbit's friends who were gathered under the big sycamore tree were certainly very happy when Dr. Rabbit told them that Mrs. Brushtail and all the little brushies were leaving the big green woods for good. "As the matter stands now," Dr. Rabbit said, "we've nobody but Brushtail to look out for. But he's surely enough. I should say he is. And if Farmer Rowe does not get him soon, I'm going to keep right on thinking of some plan to get him out of here. We can't scare him as we did Tom Wildcat. Brushtail is too cunning for that. He'd just laugh at us if we painted signs and put them up on our doors, no matter what was painted on the signs. I heard Brushtail tell Mrs. Brushtail that he would not live in that thicket anymore. He said he would get himself a new den not far off and probably a little nearer to the Murmuring Brook. So you see we could not lead Yappy to Brushtail now if we wanted to. And I am afraid Yappy will be a good while in finding Brushtail's new den. I may find it," Dr. Rabbit continued, "but I'd never risk trying to lead Yappy to it, and Jack Rabbit has a sprained foot, so he can't. But from the way he talked to me, I don't think he'd be willing to try it even if his foot weren't sprained. Possibly Yappy will smell along old Brushtail's trail and find him right in his den. Don't you ever think Brushtail will be careless enough to walk straight along the ground to his den?" said Dr. Rabbit. "He's far too wise for that, no matter where his den is. No, sir, he will make big jumps sidewise and walk back on his trail and walk in big circles, and better still, walk for a distance in the Murmuring Brook. Ah, he'll do a whole lot of things before he goes into his den. Of course," Dr. Rabbit said softly, "it is possible Farmer Rowe may trap old Brushtail. I saw him working with a trap only this morning." Several days after Dr. Rabbit had talked to his friends under the big sycamore tree, he was hopping along near the edge of the big green woods when he saw Brushtail the fox hiding behind a tree and looking toward Farmer Rowe's house. Dr. Rabbit crept under a big brush pile and looked in the same direction. What do you suppose Brushtail was watching? Well, he was looking at a big Plymouth Rock hen coming across the field right toward the place where he lay hidden. Now, if Dr. Rabbit had had something better than a brush pile to hide under, he might have made some sort of noise and warned the hen. But if he had made the least sound, Brushtail would have come diving under that brush pile in a second, for he isn't afraid of brush piles as he is of briar patches. Pretty soon the hen reached the woods. She stretched up her neck and looked around, but not seeing anything she started into the woods for some crickets. She had gone only a few steps when Brushtail the fox bounded out, seized her by the neck, and ran off through the big green woods. Dr. Rabbit followed along behind, going hoppity, 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 and presently he saw Brushtail splashing along in the Murmuring Brook. He was trotting along in the brook for a distance, for, you see, a hound cannot smell a fox's tracks in the water. And so Yappy could not track him. Dr. Rabbit stopped and looked. He saw Brushtail finally cross to the other side of the murmuring brook. Brushtail then turned and looked back to see if anybody was following him. He did not see anyone, so, still holding the dead hen in his mouth, he trotted out of sight among the trees. Of course, Dr. Rabbit knew what Brushtail was going to do. He was going to take that hen up the river to Mrs. Brushtail and the little Brushies. When Brushtail had passed out of sight, Dr. Rabbit did not go home at once. No, he sat down to think. He was trying to think out a way to drive old Brushtail out of the big green woods. He sat there and thought ever and ever so long. Sometimes he thought so hard he scratched his head without knowing it. At other times he curled his mustache. So he thought and thought, but after a long time he said he would have to give it up for this time. He was not discouraged, for he could tell from the various things he had thought of that something would turn up after a while to help him work out a plan that would get rid of Brushtail the fox. That was one fine thing about Dr. Rabbit, he would not give up. He kept right on trying. Well, for the next 2 days Dr. Rabbit was busy doctoring the little chipmunk children. They had got into Farmer Rowe's apple orchard and had eaten a lot of green apples, in spite of the fact that Mother Chipmunk had told Jimmy Chipmunk, her oldest, that he and the rest of the children should not eat green apples. The day after Dr. Rabbit cured the little chipmunk children, he thought of a new plan for catching Brushtail the fox, and he decided to try it at once. Dr. Rabbit knew very well that somehow he must drive Brushtail out of the big green woods. None of the little creatures would be safe for a moment until this was done. Yes, cruel, sly old Brushtail must be driven away, and everything depended on our clever Dr. Rabbit. As Dr. Rabbit started hopping along through the woods, he said quietly to himself, "Of course this plan I have in mind may not work. But it is worth trying anyway. I won't tell any of my friends about it, and then if I don't catch Brushtail they won't be disappointed. But if I do catch him..." Right here Dr. Rabbit stopped and laughed and laughed. "My," he continued, "if I do catch him, won't Stubby Woodchuck and Cheepy Chipmunk and all the others be surprised? Well, I should say they will." And Dr. Rabbit went hopping along, chuckling to himself and feeling mighty fine. He is always happy when he has thought of a plan to get rid of some big, cruel animal. Dr. Rabbit kept going until he came to a part of the big green woods where the murmuring brook was widest and deepest. He knew just what he was looking for too. You see, Farmer Rowe's boy had been setting his fishing lines here every night. Each morning he would pull his lines out of the water, take the fish off, and then leave 1 or 2 of the lines lying on the bank until evening. Dr. Rabbit wanted one of these fishing lines, and when he reached the place, sure enough, there was a long, stout fishing line lying right on the ground. There were some hooks on the end of the line, but Dr. Rabbit did not want these, so with his sharp teeth he cut them off. Then he picked up the line and took it some distance away to a big thicket. Here Dr. Rabbit began making a loop in one end of that fishing line and chuckling as he worked. Well, in just a little while he had that loop all fixed. Then he spread out the loop, which was made so it would slip, on a nice patch of open ground near the thicket. The other end of the line he hid in the thicket. Then he went over to the edge of the murmuring brook. He moved along the edge of the brook and watched ever so carefully. Now what do you suppose Dr. Rabbit was looking for this time? Well, sir, he was looking for a live fish. He saw several and made a grab for them, but they all got away. But Dr. Rabbit is very patient, and presently he seized a nice one and carried it, wiggling in his mouth, back to the loop he had made in that line. He dropped the small fish in the center of the loop. The fish didn't jump much now. It only wiggled and flat its tail a little, and that was just what Dr. Rabbit wanted it to do. He ran into the thicket where the other end of the line was and waited for Brushtail the fox to come along. As Dr. Rabbit waited and listened, he heard footsteps approaching. He peeped out to see who it was. It wasn't Brushtail at all. It was Gray Raccoon. And you should have seen Mr. Coon run for that fish when he saw it. Hurrah! Gray Raccoon shouted. Someone has lost a fish. Here's my breakfast right here. And he was just about to pounce upon the fish when he was almost scared out of his wits by Dr. Rabbit calling out, "Stop! Let that fish alone, neighbor. I put it there to catch Brushtail the fox. Come here, into the thicket." And so Gray Raccoon, looking rather uneasy, went into the thicket where Dr. Rabbit was hiding. "Keep right still," Dr. Rabbit whispered to his friend. "I was going to try to catch old Brushtail all by myself," he continued, "but now that you have happened along you'd better stay, for I may need some help." "How are you going to catch him, Dr. Rabbit?" Gray Raccoon asked. And Dr. Rabbit just pointed one foot out toward the loop and the squirming fish. Then Gray Raccoon understood, and how he did chuckle. He was just as much amused as was Dr. Rabbit, and they both laughed and laughed, but they had to be very quiet, of course, because at any second Brushtail might come along. Suddenly Dr. Rabbit peeked out and whispered, "Please be quiet. Keep as still as anything. There comes old Brushy now. And yes, he's coming this way." Dr. Rabbit and Gray Raccoon kept perfectly quiet in the thicket and watched Brushtail the fox as he came creeping along. When he saw the fish lying in that loop, how wide Brushtail's eyes did open. The fish jumped and squirmed just enough to make Brushtail want it very badly. He was so delighted that he stood up on his hind legs and danced toward the fish. "Ha! Ha!" he laughed. It was probably old Bald Eagle who flew over the woods and dropped his fish. "Ha! That's luck for me, a fine fish for breakfast. And I did not have to get my feet wet to catch it." Then Brushtail began to sing. Great flying Bald Eagle caught a fish, and flew away to eat him. But down it fell through green treetops, and Brushy Fox will cheat him. Brushtail finished his song and jumped for the fish. He jumped, of course, right into that loop Dr. Rabbit had made in the stout fishing cord. Well, sir, just as soon as Brushtail's feet touched the ground inside that loop, Dr. Rabbit and Gray Raccoon jerked the line as quickly and as firmly as they could. The loop slipped up and caught Brushtail around the body. But he was surprised and scared. I should say he was. He forgot the fish instantly, and he yelled ever so loud, "Let me go," although he did not know, of course, just what it was that had caught him. The way he yelled and started pulling to get away was so funny that Dr. Rabbit and Gray Raccoon laughed until they could scarcely hold the line. They wrapped the line around their paws and held on as hard as ever they could. And how Brushtail did dig his claws into the ground and pull. When he found he couldn't free himself, he was more frightened than ever and shouted because, you see, he could not see what held him. "You let go of me, you old ghost, or goblin man. You let go of me or I'll claw you to pieces. Let go of me or I'll come back there and pull all your hair out, and I'll throw you in the briars so far you'll never get out and they will stick you forever." And all the time Brushtail was talking this, he was digging his claws into the ground and pulling with all his might. Dr. Rabbit could not have held him alone, but Gray Raccoon is pretty plump and stout, and he helped a great deal. But Brushtail pulled so hard that he pulled them right out of the thicket before they knew it. Dr. Rabbit was so anxious to hold Brushtail that he cried right out, "Hold him, Gray Raccoon! Hold on to him! Hold on to him!" Then Dr. Rabbit saw his mistake, for when Brushtail the fox heard that voice he stopped pulling and turned round quickly. When he turned toward them, Gray Raccoon seized the fish, and he and Dr. Rabbit ran for their lives. And Brushtail was close behind them. Dr. Rabbit skipped away as easily as could be, and Gray Raccoon, with the fish in his mouth, started up a tree. Brushtail ran for Gray Raccoon and gave a big spring for him. He almost got him, too, for he bit him on the hind foot. But Gray Raccoon managed to get up on a limb just out of reach. Brushtail was so angry at losing the fish and being completely deceived that he jumped several times as high as he could, but he could not jump quite high enough. So Gray Raccoon just sat there and ate that fish right before Brushtail's eyes. "This is an extra good fish," Gray Raccoon called down as he gobbled it up. "It's extra good, Brushy. But you didn't want it anyway, did you?" "Ha!" Then old Brushtail was angrier than before. He pulled the loop off of his body with his teeth and snarled, "All right, for this time you and that big fat rabbit deceived me. He's pretty clever, but he'll not trick me again. And the next time I'll get both of you. I'll eat Rabbit and Coon both at one meal. In about 3 days I'll get both of you." And with an angry growl, old Brushtail the fox went off into the woods. After a while, Dr. Rabbit ventured out of his hiding place and hopped over to the tree which Gray Raccoon had climbed. "Brushtail has gone off toward the Murmuring Brook," Dr. Rabbit said. "Come on down and let me doctor your foot where he bit you. I see it's bleeding a little." Gray Raccoon came right down and laughed as he said, "My foot isn't hurt much, Doctor, and it will soon be well if you put some of your yellow salve on it." "Of course it will," Dr. Rabbit agreed, as he took some salve from his medicine case. He bandaged Ray's foot quickly, but all the time that he worked, he kept a sharp lookout for Brushtail. "He's very sly," Dr. Rabbit said, "and I am certain that right this second he is planning some way to catch us or some of our friends." "That's so," Gray Raccoon replied, looking at the bushes around him somewhat nervously. "I do wish," he continued, "that we could think of some plan to get rid of him for good. Then we could live happily and have our fun as we used to do." "Don't you worry, Neighbor Coon," Dr. Rabbit chuckled as he picked up his medicine case and looked at Gray Raccoon over his big glasses. "Don't you worry," he repeated, "I'll have a plan all in good time, and right now I'm going in the direction he went, to see what he is up to." Gray Raccoon seemed a little nervous again as he said, "Well, do be careful, whatever you do, Doctor, because he looked terribly cruel, you remember." "Ha!" Jolly Dr. Rabbit laughed as he started away, waving a paw at Gray Raccoon. "I'll take care of myself, never fear. And I'll take care of old Brushy Fox, too. Ha! Yes, I'll see what he's doing now. Perhaps I shall catch him right away." And Dr. Rabbit slipped away in the direction in which Brushtail had gone. You remember that Dr. Rabbit started out to find Brushtail the fox and watch him. Well, it was not long before Brushtail was found, and it certainly was exciting for Dr. Rabbit to watch what happened. This is the way it happened. It was Yappy who found Brushtail. Dr. Rabbit was hopping along, looking for Brushtail, when Yappy came tearing through the woods and almost ran into Brushtail. You see, Brushtail saw Yappy coming, but he thought Yappy would pass by because he had not as yet smelled the trail. These things Brushtail always knows. But Yappy passed so close he smelled Fox, and then Brushtail certainly did have to jump and run. Dr. Rabbit just sprang up on the trunk of a fallen tree to watch the race. All of a sudden he saw Farmer Rowe and his boy running toward Yappy, and with them was another big dog which joined in the chase after Brushtail. "It's a fox! A fox! It's that old fox!" shouted Farmer Rowe's boy. "Catch him, Yappy! Catch him! Catch him!" The second big hound turned Brushtail back so that he almost ran into Farmer Rowe before he saw him. Farmer Rowe threw a stick at Brushtail but missed him. "Catch him, Yappy! Catch him!" shouted Farmer Rowe. "He'll steal all my hens if you don't." Away they all ran after Brushtail the fox, Farmer Rowe and his boy yelling, and both hounds barking. "My!" exclaimed Dr. Rabbit as he sat on the fallen tree, "I certainly do hope they'll catch him." And just at that moment it looked as if they would catch Brushtail. He was in such a great hurry that in trying to jump across a wide ditch in the woods he fell right into it. And Yappy was almost upon him. "Yappy's got him!" shouted Farmer Rowe's boy. "Yappy's got him!" But Brushtail was not to be caught so easily. He sprang out of that hole in a flash, and away he ran like the wind. As Dr. Rabbit watched, Brushtail ran out of sight in the woods, and the barking of the hounds and the voices of Farmer Rowe and his boy sounded farther and farther away. Dr. Rabbit sat and waited, for he thought they might turn Brushtail back and run him past the fallen tree. But after a while they seemed farther away than ever, and he could just barely hear Yappy barking on the trail. Dr. Rabbit just sat still and waited. He knew that Brushtail the fox was one of the slyest creatures in the woods, and he was pretty sure now that he would get away for this time at least. I should not be surprised if he came sneaking back right around here. And still, Dr. Rabbit said hopefully, Yappy may get him. I'll just wait for a time and see what does happen. Several times as Dr. Rabbit sat there he heard a noise in the bushes nearby, and each time he looked quickly in that direction. But it must have been the wind blowing the leaves, for he did not see anything. Once, however, Dr. Rabbit was really startled. A big wood rat ran through some dead leaves, and made a good deal of noise. He stopped and looked at Dr. Rabbit and asked, "Are you waiting for someone?" "Yes," Dr. Rabbit replied, "I'm waiting for Brushtail the fox. I'm expecting him any time." "Brushtail the fox!" exclaimed the wood rat. "Well, I'm not going to wait for him." And he hurried away as fast as he could. Then Dr. Rabbit heard another noise. Some creature was creeping through the bushes not far off. He was coming nearer, too. Dr. Rabbit sat on the trunk of the fallen tree and never moved a muscle as he listened to the animal creeping through the thicket. Every now and then it would stop, and there was not a sound. Then it would move again, and all the time it kept coming nearer and nearer. Dr. Rabbit has a way of twitching his nose most of the time, but as he sat there he did not even move his nose. No, sir. He was as still as the tree trunk on which he sat. He kept his eyes right on the place from which the sounds of the creeping animal came. And then his heart gave a thump and beat very fast, for out of the thicket came old Brushtail himself. He looked all about carefully, and then sat down panting, tired out from his long run. But after he was somewhat rested, Brushtail got up and grinned. He looked out in the woods in the direction where Yappy and the other hound were still running and barking. "Ha!" Brushtail chuckled softly. "They've lost my trail. I knew they would when I walked down the murmuring brook. Well," he continued, "I'll just look around a bit for something to eat. Perhaps I can find that big fat rabbit." It happened that Brushtail started right for the fallen tree where Dr. Rabbit sat, and Dr. Rabbit was just about to spring off and run when something else happened. Farmer Rose's big gray goose came near. She was eating some tender green grass blades and never dreamed that a fox was near. But Brushtail saw her and started creeping toward her. Dr. Rabbit could not bear to see that big gray goose gobbled up, so he shouted as loud as he could, "Look out, Gray Goose! Brushtail the fox is going to get you. He's coming. He's coming." Now, as you may know, a tame goose cannot fly very far, but many of them can fly a short distance, and fly fairly high too. The gray goose was terribly frightened, and instantly began flapping her great wings. She flew just high enough in the air so that Brushtail missed her when he sprang. If the murmuring brook had not been near, that gray goose would surely have been caught, because, as I have said, she cannot fly very far. But as it was, she managed to fly across the brook. Then she came to the ground again and ran screaming and flapping her wings toward Farmer Rose. She got out of the woods in a few moments, and Brushtail the fox did not catch her. Now when Dr. Rabbit shouted, Brushtail turned quickly and saw him, but knowing that he could not catch both of them, he sprang for the gray goose. But Brushtail did not swim across Murmuring Brook. He knew it would take him too long, and he saw that he could not catch the gray goose after all. So he turned from the edge of the brook and started back after Dr. Rabbit. But Brushtail was angry at Dr. Rabbit. "It was that big fat rabbit that made me miss my dinner," snarled Brushtail. "I saw him sitting on that fallen tree. It was he who warned that goose." And Brushtail ran swiftly to the fallen tree, and darted quickly all around it. He sprang into the nearby thickets and charged under some small brush piles. In fact, he raced around and hunted in every spot where he thought Dr. Rabbit might be hiding, and all the time he kept up an angry growl. "I'll get him! I'll get him, Brushtail kept snarling. I'll get that big fat rabbit if it takes me a week. A few days after Dr. Rabbit had helped Farmer Roe's big gray goose to escape from Brushtail the fox, Dr. Rabbit saw something that interested him greatly. Farmer Roe was working at something out in the woods. There was a briar patch nearby, so Dr. Rabbit crept into this and watched. Yes, sir. Farmer Roe was actually setting a trap, or rather, he was setting 4 traps. And he was surely arranging things so that if Brushtail could ever be deceived at all, he could be deceived here, or so it seemed, at least. Farmer Roe had chosen a low place in the woods, full of the finest white sand. He staked the traps and set them in the sand, and covered them all over with sand so that they could not be seen. Then he dragged an old cow's head right in the center of the 4 traps. Now, you see, it looked just as if some animal had been eating the cow's head and had left it right in that nice fine white sand. And if Mr. Fox should happen along, it looked as if he might try to go right up to that head. Then he would be sure to step into one of those traps. Well, all the rest of that day and most of the night Dr. Rabbit watched those traps and that cow's head. At last, far along in the night, he heard a noise in the bushes close by. The moon shone very brightly through the trees, and on that patch of white sand and the cow's head, a dark form came slipping out of the shadows and kept coming nearer. Pretty soon Dr. Rabbit saw who it was. It was Brushtail the fox. Brushtail sniffed toward the cow's head and said, well, fresh beef, this is pretty fine, and he began walking around and around that cow's head. But he seemed a little suspicious, for he did not walk right up to the head. Still, he kept getting closer and closer. And then, all of a sudden, he stumbled over something. What's this? Brushtail exclaimed. He dug around a little in the sand, then said, Oh, I see. It's a stake I stumbled over, and here is a chain, and why sure enough, there is a trap fastened to the chain. Ha, no beef tonight, thank you. I'll just wait. Perhaps some animal will drag that head away and hide it. Then I'll just help myself. Sooner or later I'll get that head, and Brushtail trotted away. But he did not go far until he stopped and sniffed again in the direction of the cow's head. My! Exclaimed Brushtail, that meat certainly does smell good, so good that I am almost tempted to go back and try to get it. But I'm afraid. I'll just wait as I said, and I'll get that cow's head as sure as anything. And laughing to himself because he believed he was so clever, Brushtail stole softly away into the woods. Well, Brushtail is clever, but someone else was just a bit cleverer, and that was Dr. Rabbit. Of course, Dr. Rabbit was greatly disappointed when Brushtail the fox discovered that there was a trap set in the sand, because he had thought surely Brushtail would be caught. Then, after Brushtail had gone away, Dr. Rabbit suddenly thought of something. Yes, sir. It came to him in an instant, a plan to get rid of Brushtail the fox. And the plan was suggested to Dr. Rabbit by Brushtail's remark. Perhaps some animal will drag that head away and hide it. Then I'll just help myself. Well, as soon as it was daylight, Dr. Rabbit hurried right over to Jack Rabbit's, told him what his plan was, and brought Jack Rabbit back with him. Then Dr. Rabbit hurried around through the big green woods telling his friends. He told Stubby Woodchuck, Cheepy Chipmunk, Chatty Red Squirrel, Frisky Gray Squirrel, Robin the Red Opossum, Busy Blue Jay, Cockcrow, and quite a number of others. He asked them all to come about the middle of the morning to the place where Farmer Roe had placed the cow's head, as he would need every one of them at about that time. Immediately Dr. Rabbit and Jack Rabbit hurried away toward Farmer Roe's back lot. They squeezed under a board fence and began looking for something. Here it is, Dr. Rabbit said, picking up a stout piece of rope that had been part of a clothesline. I knew it was in here somewhere, Jack Rabbit said, for I saw it just yesterday. Now, said Dr. Rabbit, let's go back to the woods and find that slim hickory tree that has a grapevine hanging from the top. They ran into the woods, and after a little search found the hickory. They hid the rope they had found and hurried over to the cow's head in the sand. There they found all the other little creatures. After a great deal of very careful work, Dr. Rabbit, Jack Rabbit, and Opossum managed to get the cow's head outside the circle of traps. Then every one of Dr. Rabbit's friends helped to pull and push the cow's head. It was a strange procession. After quite a while they succeeded in pushing and pulling the cow's head to the slim hickory tree. Dr. Rabbit told them now to push it into a nearby thicket, and they did. Opossum exclaimed, "Woo, I'm tired. Now let's eat the head." Everybody but Opossum laughed at that, and Dr. Rabbit said, "No, Brother Possum, not just yet, but you are helping wonderfully, and tomorrow morning I think you can have this head all to yourself. I think we'll be rid of Brushtail the fox by that time." Dr. Rabbit now grabbed hold of the grapevine that hung from the top of the hickory, and he and all his friends pulled and pulled until they bent the top of the hickory down to the thicket. Then, while his friends held the treetop down, Dr. Rabbit made a snare or loop of the rope he had found, and arranged it in the thicket so that if Brushtail got to the cow's head he would have to step through the snare, or slip noose. Finally, Dr. Rabbit tied the tree rather loosely to a small twig of the thicket and told his friends to step back carefully, because the least thing would make the tree fly up as it was before and take that snare with it. Dr. Rabbit and all his friends stood back and watched to see whether the tree would fly back, but it did not. It held as firm and quiet as could be. "Now," said Dr. Rabbit, "old Brushy will come back to where that head was, and, seeing it gone, he will naturally think that Opossum or somebody has dragged it away. So Brushtail will smell along the ground where we have dragged the head, and he will finally find it right here. I have hidden the noose in the thicket so that Mr. Fox will not notice it, and he'll walk right in to get that head. In doing so, he'll put his head through that noose and pull on it, trying to get to the head. Well, when Mr. Brushtail pulls, he'll break that slender twig that holds the tree down, because that twig is about ready to break as it is. Then we'll see what will happen. Let's hurry away now," Dr. Rabbit added. "If Foxy Brushtail happened to see all of us here at once he might become suspicious. I'll come back soon and watch, and if anything happens I'll let all of you know at once." So away went Stubby Woodchuck and Opossum and all the others, talking quietly yet excitedly, and now and then laughing a little. They said they hoped Brushtail would come soon, and they also said that something just told them away down deep in their hearts that Brushtail was surely going to be caught this time. And all that day they could scarcely eat, they were so eager to know whether Brushtail would get caught in that noose in the thicket. Dr. Rabbit hid not far from the cow's head and waited all day. Then he went to supper and came quickly back. Pretty soon night came, and the big round moon came up. Along about midnight Dr. Rabbit heard a sound. Pit-a-pat, pit-a-pat, pit-a-pat. Someone was coming along slowly through the woods. Then, as the form came nearer, Dr. Rabbit saw Brushtail the fox trotting along with his sharp nose to the ground, smelling the trail where that cow's head had been dragged. "Well, sir," Brushtail went right up to the thicket where the noose was. Then he laughed and laughed and laughed. "Well, well," said Brushtail, "I guess I'm just a little too smart for anybody around these woods. Ha! It's just as I thought. That possum or somebody has been careless enough to walk right in among those traps that Farmer Rowe set and drag that head up here. Well, I'll just go on into this thicket and bring that head out and take charge of it myself. There's enough meat to last me several days." And Brushtail started into the thicket. When Brushtail the fox started into the thicket to get the cow's head, he never dreamed, of course, that there was anything there to catch him. So he plunged right into the thicket. Swish! Up went that tall, slim hickory tree, and Brushtail with it. You never heard such a yell as Brushtail gave. He yelled so loudly that all the little creatures of the big green woods were awakened, and Dr. Rabbit did not have to call them. They all came running toward the place where the snare had been set. Even Jack Rabbit, away out in the wide prairie, heard Brushtail yell, and Jack Rabbit came running as fast as he could. In a little time all the little creatures of the big green woods were there. Now, you see, Brushtail had put his front legs through that noose, so that it held him around the body just behind his forelegs. The rope did not hurt him much, although it pulled considerably. So he dangled up there and howled, while all the little creatures below shouted and danced for joy. Of course, when Brushtail saw all the little creatures come so quickly, he knew a trick had been played upon him, but he was too badly scared to be angry. I should say he was. He was about scared out of his wits when that tree jerked him up into the air, and he was about as badly scared now as ever, because he could not see how he was ever going to get down from there. "Let me down!" Brushtail shouted, clawing wildly at the air. "Oh yes," said Dr. Rabbit. "I suppose we'll let you down, Foxy Brushy. I suppose we know what you would do to us mighty quick if you caught us. Yes, it's likely we'll let you down. Ha!" And Dr. Rabbit and all his friends danced around under the tree and laughed and laughed. "I'll go out of these woods and never, never, never come back if you'll just let me down," Brushtail promised. And he really meant it. This was just what Dr. Rabbit was waiting to hear Brushtail say. But Dr. Rabbit said, "We'll go over to my house for a little while and talk the matter over." And, with Brushtail begging them to come back and let him down, they all hurried over to Dr. Rabbit's house in the big tree. When they were inside, Dr. Rabbit seated them all in his best chairs. Then he stood up and said, "My friends, I just wanted to have you all come over here and stay until morning." So they talked and had a good time at Dr. Rabbit's until morning. It was just daylight when they went back to the Slim Hickory. Brushtail was still hanging there, and when he saw them how he did yell to be let down. "Very well, Brother Brushy," Dr. Rabbit said, "we'll let you down, and if you ever come back into our woods again—" "Oh," yelled Brushtail before Dr. Rabbit could say another word, "I'll never, never, never come back if I can get down. I'd rather live on crickets and bugs all my life than to take chances." But Brushtail did not say any more, because he wanted to get down right away. "Oh, Possum," said Dr. Rabbit, "if you'll go up and gnaw that rope in two so that old Brushtail can drop to the ground, you may have that cow's head all for yourself." "I'll do that," Opossum said, and he began climbing the tree. Presently Opossum was above Brushtail, and began gnawing the rope. "Oh, dear me!" shouted Brushtail after Opossum had gnawed for a time. "It's an awfully long way to the ground, I'm afraid." And then Opossum got the rope gnawed right in two. Brushtail struck the ground. Well, sir, he got right up and started to run. He was so stiff he could not run well at first, but the farther he went the faster he ran. After he got across the murmuring brook he went away through the woods on the other side like a streak. I don't know of anything that could have scared Brushtail and made him stay scared as that snare did. Brushtail the fox never came around the big green woods after that, and Dr. Rabbit and his friends were certainly glad and happy. Published and edited by Ligohi Software. Rights have been reserved to this audio-visual recording. To find more books and information about other educational resources, please visit ligohi.com.